This is one sentence from a statement the Department of Energy handed to the United States Senate on the 22nd of April, 1985. It says 5,121,717 kilograms of uranium had been disposed of in pits on the site. Not spilled. Not lost. Put into the ground deliberately over 30 years and left there. The site is about 18 miles northwest of downtown Cincinnati. The man who signed that statement was Joe Legrone, manager of the Department of Energy's Oak Ridge Operations Office. He delivered it in a hearing room in Cincinnati in front of the people who lived downwind. What follows is what the United States government said about itself out loud in one day on the record. Almost nobody has read it since. The plant was called the Feed Materials Production Center. It sat on about 1,000 acres near the village of Fernald in Hamilton County, Ohio. The name is accurate, and it is also a kind of camouflage. Feed materials meant feed for reactors. Ronald Cochran of the Department of Energy explained it to the committee. The plant took uranium and made it into metal, and the metal went to other government sites to be built into reactor fuel and targets. At the far end of that process was plutonium, and at the far end of the plutonium were warheads. Fernald was the first step in the American nuclear weapons cycle, and by 1985 it was the only plant of its kind operating in the United States. It opened in 1951, and it was run for the government by a private contractor, National Lead of Ohio. Everyone in the record calls it NLO. Construction cost about $117 million, with another $60 million spent expanding it in the mid-50s. Production peaked in 1960 and began falling off in '64. Through the 1970s, the government considered closing the place, so it spent as little on it as it could. Then, in 1981, the orders came back. By the spring of 1985, the plant was running at 288% of its 1979 output, and the staff had gone from 538 people to over 1,000. The thing that caught uranium dust before it went out the stack was a bag house, rows of long fabric bags like the world's largest vacuum cleaner. When a bag tore, the dust went out the stack. The Senate asked how often that happened, and it asked about one particular day. On the 3rd of February 1959, an internal memo went from J.W. McKelvey to Dr. J.A. Quigley, the plant's director of health and safety. It recorded a loss of 240 pounds of uranium. The reason given was that no new bags were available, and management decided the collector would keep operating with the defective bags until new ones came in. They knew the filters were torn. They decided to keep running. The committee added that the plant had occasionally bought inferior bags, and that reports showed large numbers of bag failures from inadequate inspection and maintenance. The contractor's written answer is 4 sentences long. It says the discharge of 248 pounds of uranium was not taken lightly. The question said 240 pounds. The answer said 248. Nobody in 434 pages ever reconciles the two. And the answer does not answer. It was asked whether the company had experimented with cheaper bags that failed more easily. It replies that the people involved wanted to avoid losses. The Senate also asked why nobody noticed the leak sooner. The reply is the most revealing paragraph in the volume. NLO wrote that it had recognized early the need for a device that would sound an alarm when a stack release of radioactive material was occurring. And then, but no such device existed, so they improvised. They took a handheld radiation survey meter, the kind an inspector carries on a belt, and adapted it to sit inside the stack sampler. They began testing it in the Plant 9 stack 2 years before the hearing. That is to say, around 1983. The plant had been running since 1951. For roughly 3 decades, nothing at that stack told anyone in the moment that uranium was leaving it. So here's the arithmetic the government finally did on itself. Over about 30 years of operation, the total discharge to the air was 95,954 kilograms of uranium. 74,308 kilograms went to the water, and 5,121,717 kilograms went into the pits. In pounds, the amount that went into the air is a little over 200,000. A woman named Kathy Meyer put that number to the committee herself, and she put it the way a neighbor would. 200,000 pounds of radioactive material was released. Not 1 or 2 pounds, she said. 200,000 pounds. She also told them what the plant said every single time. After every release that was ever made public, the press announcement always stated, "There is no harmful effects as a result of this release." You can cry wolf only so often, she said, before people do not believe you. The other standard answer was that the leak stayed on plant property. Dust particles released into the atmosphere, she said, did not automatically stop at a fence line. Then there were the silos. Concrete silos stood above ground on the site. 2 of them held what the record calls K-65 residues, high radium leftovers from processing uranium ore. They were shipped in from a plant in St. Louis and a site at Niagara Falls, and they went into those silos between 1952 and 1959. The contractor gave the committee the contents. 8,800 metric tons of material in the 2 silos. Inside that, 11.2 metric tons of uranium and 3.64 pounds of radium. In the typed original, the word pounds is underlined. That underline is the contractor telling the Senate it is only a few pounds. Radium is measured in grams and fractions of grams. The women who painted radium onto watch dials and died of it were carrying micrograms. The radium was evolving radon gas, and the radon was seeping up through the concrete roofs of the silos. The proposed fix was to build a second set of concrete roofs over the first, strong enough to hold 4 to 6 feet of earth on top. The solution to a leaking container was to bury the container. Now the part that is hardest to read. Legrone told the committee what was in those 2 silos and then added one more clause. In those 2 silos are about 20,000 kilograms of material, he said. Plus, there is material unaccounted for on the order of in excess of 330,000 kilograms of material. Unaccounted for. 330,000 kilograms. That is the manager of Oak Ridge Operations telling the United States Senate that the government could not say where 1/3 kilograms of its own radioactive material had gone. Congressman Tom Lucan of Cincinnati asked about the pits and put it to the 2 Energy Department witnesses as a number. Hundreds of thousands of tons of uncharacterized waste. Uncharacterized means nobody had established what was in it. Legrone answered, "I think that's a fair statement. They had been putting material in those pits since the Truman administration, and in 1985 they could not tell a congressman what was down there. Underneath all of it is the Great Miami Aquifer. One of the statements filed with the committee calls it the largest underground source of water in the Midwest. In 1981, the United States Geological Survey looked at wells near the plant and found uranium in the water. The survey said further study was needed to determine where the uranium was coming from, and that it did not have the money or the people to do it. 3 wells were eventually identified as contaminated. One of them served a rented farmhouse on Willey Road. The tenant was a woman named Lisa Crawford, and she had 2 things to tell the United States Senate. Neither took long. The first was that she learned about the well on the 11th of January, 1985. The second was how long her family had been drinking out of it. "Yes," she said, "for 5 years. We knew nothing about it. Lucan told her what the readings meant. Hers was the highest of the three, something like 20 or 30 times the safe level the Environmental Protection Agency was then considering. And then he said the sentence that explains this entire story. But of course, the Department of Energy has its own standard, which may be, he said, as high as 100 to 150 times higher than EPA's. The agency that made the uranium also set the limit for how much uranium was allowed to be in your drinking water, and it measured its own compliance. The well owners were told there was uranium in their water. There was one word they were not told. A Department of Energy report stated that the homeowners had not been informed that the uranium was slightly enriched. Enriched matters for exactly one reason. Uranium occurs in the ground naturally. Enriched uranium does not. Enriched uranium has been through a plant. Telling a family there is uranium in their well leaves open the possibility that it had always been there. Telling them it is enriched tells them where it came from. Lucan took the two Energy Department witnesses through it one question at a time. If there were uranium in the well at your home, which you use for drinking water, would you be concerned? LeGrone. I would be, yes, sir. Then if you would be concerned about it, you would also think you would be entitled to know whether that uranium was enriched or not. LeGrone. Yes, sir. Lucan read the report back to him and called the omission what he thought it was. Because this has to be intentional, he said, withholding that information. LeGrone said he had spoken to the man who wrote that section and that the man's intent had been the opposite, to make clear the uranium was theirs, that it had come from the plant. There was never any intention, LeGrone said, on my part, his, or anyone else's in our office to deceive anyone on that point. Lucan's reply is the best sentence in the volume. I submit that that might be characterized as bureaucratese on his part. LeGrone tried once more. The enrichment level, he said, was low enough that it was not considered a health problem. I know, Lucan said, but that is not the point. Whether it was a health problem was never the reason to leave the word out. The word enriched would have told those families exactly whose uranium was in their water. Here's how the neighbors found out any of this. Between September and December of 1984, the bag house on Plant 9 failed and uranium oxide went out the stack. LeGrone was informed on the 7th of December. The plants were shut down and an incident investigation board was convened. It finished its report on the 6th of February. That December, the Department of Energy called a public meeting to tell the community. It held it in the auditorium of Crosby Elementary School, 1 mile from the plant. 250 children went to that school every day. Kathy Meyer had 2 of them there, age 6 and 7. She told the Senate what the department said to the hundreds of people in that room. We've known about this for 5 years. We're studying the problem and hope to know its source next spring. They would not say where the contamination was, she said, not even its general area. A room full of parents in their children's school were told the government had known for 5 years and would get back to them. 6 months before that meeting, in June of 1984, an Oak Ridge task force had finished its own review of the plant. Senator John Glenn read the committee what it found. NLO management, it said, had unacceptable attitudes toward health, safety, and environmental protection. It documented deficiencies in maintenance, in operator training and supervision. It found a lack of receptivity to newer, safer production technology. Those are not just my opinions, Glenn said. Those are opinions out of the Department of Energy Task Force report. Then the sentence he had come to Cincinnati to say, yet despite these shortcomings, the department still saw fit to rate NLO excellent or superior in overall performance, and the rating was accompanied by a bonus award of well over $1 million. Glenn put it to the plant manager directly. Robert Spenceley answered, I think that is correct. The scale of it is in the written record. Out of 77 performance ratings assigned to NLO, 10 were superior, 50 were excellent, 14 satisfactory, 3 poor. 3 poor ratings at a plant that had put 5 million kilograms of uranium in the ground. Lucan had a comparison ready, and in April of 1985, everybody in that room knew what was coming. 4 months earlier, a gas leak at a Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, had killed thousands of people in a single night. According to your system of evaluation, Lucan said it would be possible for Union Carbide to get an E for excellence in Bhopal, India, as long as they provided the production, he said, and the budgetary considerations for management. Do you have any comment on that? LeGrone: I would have no comment on it, sir. A few minutes earlier, Lucan had asked the same 2 men a simpler question 3 times. Were they aware that the Environmental Protection Agency had rated Fernald the highest emitter of radionuclides in the country? Ronald Cochran said he was personally not aware of that. LeGrone said he had heard it but had not seen such a list. Well, that scares me, Lucan said. Glenn had asked the Environmental Protection Agency to do something nobody had done before: go back through the plant's own emission records and calculate what the neighbors had actually received. He released the results that morning. Between 1956 and 1969, a person living at the northeast boundary of the plant would have taken an average annual dose to the lung equivalent to about 140 chest X-rays every year for 14 years. In the worst year, 1956, the dose at that boundary was equivalent to about 460 chest X-rays. That figure, Glenn said, is nearly double the occupational radiation limit, the limit for people who go to work in a nuclear plant knowing exactly what they are walking into. For the general public, he said, those doses would exceed the EPA standard by over 12,000%, about 125 times the government set limit. The people at that boundary were farming. Glenn's staff also submitted written questions to the department afterward, and the answers were printed in the back of the volume. One of them is a single question I want to read to you exactly as it appears. Does the Department of Energy maintain an active system for acquiring tissue samples, organs, or whole bodies of workers for research purposes? The answer begins: the Department of Energy does maintain an active system for acquiring tissue samples, organs, or whole bodies of workers for research purposes. It names them: the United States Transuranium Registries, established in 1968, and the Uranium Registry, established in 1970. The stated purpose is to understand how these elements behave in humans and to set radiation protection standards. The answer does not describe how consent was obtained, and nobody at the hearing followed up. I am telling you what the page says and nothing beyond it. The people who lived around the plant got about 10 minutes. They came as an organization they had built that winter. Fernald Residents for Environmental Safety and Health. In the record, it is always the acronym. FRESH. Kathy Meyer chaired it. She read 4 requests into the record, and all 4 were about the same thing. Take the standard setting away from the Department of Energy. Let the Environmental Protection Agency monitor the waste. Put air monitors out in every direction. Pay for the cleanup. The crux of the problem, she said, is that the department, while producing the materials that endanger our health, sets its own standards and monitors its own performance. Unless that changes, she said, we can never feel safe. Then the line that got quoted: a good neighbor does not take 30 years to meet its neighbors. She finished by telling them she was pregnant. I sit here before you with my 3rd child, she said, and I wonder daily if that child is already damaged physically just by breathing the air and living in the home that I do. Beside her sat the Union, Gene Branham, president of the Fernald Atomic Trades and Labor Council. 32 years at the plant, speaking for 15 international unions and about 627 workers. He offered the committee 2 quotations. The first, he said, came from the director of the Health and Safety Department at National Lead. "You have to eat a teaspoonful of uranium a day for it to hurt you." The chairman, Senator Thad Cochran, stopped him. "What?" "I couldn't understand you." Branham repeated it, then gave them the second, which he attributed to an assistant plant manager. "The most dangerous thing you could do with our uranium is to drop it on someone's foot." Branham also told them he had names, depositions, and documentation about workers who had gotten sick, and that he could not hand any of it over in that room, because carrying documents off the plant site could be treated as a security violation. He asked instead that a member of Senator Glenn's staff come out to the plant and take them there. National security at that plant in that year meant a union president could not carry a piece of paper about sick men through a gate. The state of Ohio was in the room too. Anthony Celebrezze, the Attorney General, testified about his state's legal efforts against a federal facility inside its own borders. He told Lucan the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency had spent months trying to get access to the site. Most of the initial response, he said, was denial of access or an uncooperative attitude. That changed after Ohio filed a formal 60-day notice of intent to sue. Asked why the problem existed at all, he said the plant was built on an emergency basis some 30 years ago and essentially has never been technologically updated. 3 months before the hearing in January of 1985, the neighbors had already sued. The case was in Ray Fernald litigation in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio. They sued National Lead of Ohio and its parent, NL Industries. The claims were emotional distress and the loss of value in their property. In 1989, it settled, and the court's order records $78 million to the class. The New York Times reported the figure as $73 million. Both numbers are in the literature. I could not reconcile them from primary documents, so I'm telling you the court order says 78. Part paid people for distress. Part paid landowners. Part funded a medical monitoring program that ran for decades. Production at Fernald stopped in 1989. The mission changed from making uranium to cleaning up after it. In 1990, the workers sued in a case called Day against NLO. They brought it under the Price-Anderson Act, which Congress had amended in 1988 to create federal jurisdiction for what the statute calls an extraordinary nuclear occurrence. That is the phrase Congress wrote, and a federal court applied it to a plant that had never had an accident. Only 30 years of ordinary operation. The judge was S. Arthur Spiegel. The class was workers and frequenters who had been at the plant 6 continuous weeks. What they asked for was not damages for cancer. Cancer claims were specifically excluded and reserved for later. What they asked for was a court-supervised program to watch them for the rest of their lives. That case settled in 1994 in the middle of trial, and then Judge Spiegel did something worth sitting with. He had pushed for that settlement. He had run the negotiations himself. Under the rules, he was also the person who had to decide whether the settlement was fair to the class. So he transferred the fairness hearing to another judge, Sandra Beckwith, and wrote down why. Out of an abundance of caution, he wrote, "We are anxious to avoid even the appearance of unfairness." A federal judge would not review his own work on a settlement he believed in, because it might look wrong. For 34 years, the agency that made the uranium had set the standard for the uranium, measured itself against that standard, and rated its contractor excellent. The whole story is in the distance between those 2 paragraphs. The cleanup took 17 years. The Department of Energy's own fact sheet puts the cost at $4.4 billion and calls it one of the largest environmental cleanup operations ever undertaken in United States history. The silos were emptied and dismantled. Their contents went to Andrews County, Texas, and to Utah in thousands of sealed containers. The last container of the treated radium waste was placed in Texas on the 2nd of November, 2009, 50 years after it arrived in Ohio. But the contaminated soil did not leave. It went into a cell built on the property. In the documents, it is called the on-site disposal facility. 8 cells under one continuous cap, about 950 feet across, 3,600 feet long and up to 65 feet high. Approximately 2.96 million cubic yards of impacted material were placed in it. And read why they put it where they put it. The location was chosen because of the thickness of the gray clay layer that overlies the Great Miami Aquifer. They picked the spot by how well the ground would hold it in. The site is 1,050 acres and it is open to the public. It is called the Fernald Preserve. About 900 acres were ecologically restored. Upland forest, riparian forest, wetlands, and tallgrass prairie. There are 7 miles of trail. More than 250 species of birds have been recorded there, and over 100 of them nest there. In 2019, the Environmental Protection Agency gave it a national award for site reuse. The department's fact sheet says the site has now come full circle. The same fact sheet says 2 other things on the same page in smaller type. The first is that groundwater extraction and treatment is the only remaining remediation activity and that the main contaminant is uranium. They are still pumping the aquifer, 41 years after Lisa Crawford was told about her well. The second is that the Office of Legacy Management continues routine inspections, care, and monitoring of the on-site disposal facility. Continues. There is no end date in that sentence because there is not one. The Visitors Center at the Fernald Preserve is a converted warehouse. Its address is on Willey Road. That is the road the contaminated wells were on. You can drive out there this weekend, park, and walk 7 miles of trail through restored prairie past birds that were not there in 1985. Under the grass is nearly 3 million cubic yards of the ground this plant contaminated, held down by a clay layer somebody measured very carefully. And somewhere in the accounting, 330,000 kilograms nobody could ever locate. The hearing that made all of this public is 438 pages long. The government printing office published it in 1985. Anyone could have read it on any day in the 41 years since. Your family lived in Crosby Township, or Ross, or Shandon, or New Baltimore, or Harrison. I would like to know what you were told and when you were told it. Because the record says the government knew for 30 years and told you in December in an elementary school auditorium, 1 mile from the fence. Every source in this episode is listed in the description. All of it is public. All of it always was.